and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Coming up on our show, California Congressman Adam Schiff joins us in the studio to discuss this week's events in Charlottesville. Plus, a one-on-one with Carol Christ, the new Chancellor of UC Berkeley. But first, White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon is out. President Trump fired him today. This comes in the wake of continuing fallout from Charlottesville. San Francisco city officials are calling on the National Park Service to deny a permit for a right-wing rally later this month at Crissy Field near the Golden Gate Bridge. In Washington, Republican lawmakers found themselves once again weighing the cost of remaining loyal to President Trump after his controversial comments about white supremacists.
Excuse me. What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
This is let
me ask you this. What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do. I'm not putting anybody on a moral plane. What I'm saying is this. You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious, and it was horrible, and it was a horrible thing to watch. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either.
And joining me now to discuss the political, cultural, and economic firestorm are senior writer at Politico, Carla Marinucci, and Hoover Institution Research Fellow Lanhee Chen. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Lanhee, Steve Bannon gone.
Yeah.
Your reaction?
Yeah, big news. Well, Steve Bannon may be gone, but the influence of Steve Bannon won't be gone. Because if you look at the president's rhetoric this week, what's pretty clear is that he has adopted the nationalist tone and the rhetoric and the language of Steve Bannon, even though Bannon's influence has been waning for some time. So you look, for example, at the president's tweet regarding Confederate monuments and statues. And I mean, that has Steve Bannon written all over it, even though his influence in the White House, by all measure, hasn't been what it was at the start of the administration. So he may be gone, but I wouldn't expect the influences, the nationalist, inward-looking influences to go away.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is starting to look like Survivor. Who's next to be voted off this island? I think you're right, Lanhee. A lot of people are watching Bannon's departure with a sigh of relief, but the fact is he's had the influence already. He's done the damage already. And now the question is, can anybody, or who will fill his shoes, if anybody? Does Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump fill in the role that they're supposed to, which is somehow bringing back rational and more centrist thought to the president? I'm not so sure about that. I think Bannon is going to do a lot of damage back at Breitbart. He's going to become, I think, a figurehead for that movement and that group, and I think he can work outside the White House and still have a tremendous influence on Trump.
Do you think the firing actually enhances his public image at Breitbart? And because now he has grounds to come back and say, you know, I was there, they kicked me out, let's lead a new movement.
You know, I don't know that that's what's going to happen. I think if you look at people that have left the Donald Trump immediate orbit, people like Corey Lewandowski, Dave Bossie, who was his deputy campaign manager, these people remain in contact with the president, remain friendly with the president. Jason Miller's another one, former communications director for the campaign. They've remained friendly with the president. And so I think in all likelihood, Bannon remains in touch with the president, maybe sees some synergies from the outside. I think he'll have the freedom to call out the president, too, when he disagrees with him. And here's the interesting part of this. The people who are left in the White House in key policymaking positions, Gary Cohn, definitely not your sort of firebrand conservative nor a nationalist, somebody who adopts pretty centrist policy. Ivanka and Jared, both of them seen as relatively moderate. So the interesting question is going to be at some point, do they take over? Do they sort of put a more legitimate imprimatur on the policymaking coming out of the White House?
And I think it's, you know, some of the ideas that Bannon advanced, the idea of a deep state, this whole nationalist thought, that imprint still remains on the White House, and it's still, he's had tremendous influence on the alt-right and the white supremacist groups out there, and we're going to see whether that continues, even outside the White House.
Let's talk about Charlottesville. It's sparking reverberations here in the Bay Area, as it is throughout the nation. We have growing opposition to the upcoming Crissy Field rally by right-wing groups. We have two local men who have lost their jobs now after it was revealed they were connected to the white supremacist event in Virginia. Were they appropriate reactions? Lanhee, or do you think that perhaps this is having a chilling effect on free speech?
Well, I mean, let's be absolutely clear. There's no room for KKK neo-Nazi views in a civilized society, and I don't think there can be any debate about that. But it is clear, too, there are differences of opinion about politics. And I think people on the right for a long time, not the alt-right, but people who are conservatives, have felt, particularly in the Bay Area, there isn't an opportunity to express an alternate point of view. So I think the question is, what is the sort of right line to be drawn? What is the right line, the right needle to be threaded, if you will? And I think that's something that people are still grappling with. There is a legitimate set of complaints on the right, I think, about the suffocation of an alternative point of view, not, of course, this sort of crazy point of view that was articulated in Charlottesville. But how do you differentiate between the two? That's the problem now.
Yeah, and one of the big problems, I think, is both for Berkeley and San Francisco, officials here are between a rock and a hard place. If they deny the right of these right-wing groups to speak out, then they're denying free speech. On the other hand, we've seen what's happened at Berkeley before. So this is a very tough situation, but at the same time, you've got Dianne Feinstein, you've got a growing number of public officials really worried about what could happen. We'll see how that plays out, but I think we are going to see more and more of these events. Berkeley, particularly, home is free speech, has been targeted so many times by these groups. So,
and far left groups have come in and created chaos as well.
Right.
So it's not just the far right.
That's right.
And also, what we're seeing more and more of in the country is also Confederate statues and monuments and symbols coming down. In fact, Nancy Pelosi now wants to remove Confederate statues from the U.S. Capitol. We've seen it happen as well in Los Angeles, San Diego. Is there a risk here, though, that we're moving toward revisionist history, which is the argument that some people are making?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, you know, my colleague Condoleezza Rice has actually opined on this very topic, and she's basically said, look, there are a lot of these things that may be personally offensive to her, may be offensive to people that she grew up with, but there is a role for some of these statues and monuments to remind us historically of a path we don't want to go down, to remind us of a darker period in our history. So I think we do have to be a little bit careful about blanket conclusions. Ultimately, this is going to be something that local authorities are going to have to make a decision about, right? So if people in LA feel like there's a particular monument that's offensive to people there and doesn't stand for anything but values that are offensive to a civil society, then they should have the ability to remove those things. But I don't think we can make a blanket conclusion.
Should they be in a public space, or should they just be in a museum? If you want to see the history, go to the museum.
And perhaps that's the conclusion that some places will draw. But you know, here's a tough thing. You know, the symbols of the Confederacy are so loaded. They have meaning for so many people in a very hurtful way. That's why this discussion goes beyond merely sort of saying what is historical, what is respect of history, and what is not. But ultimately, look, we're going to view this very differently sitting here in the Bay Area from people who live in Birmingham, Alabama, or Tallahassee, Florida. So we have to be very careful to allow those localities to make those decisions.
Isn't this where the president got in trouble this week in terms of calling them beautiful statues, part of our culture, and worse, equating Robert E. Lee with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson? It's showing a sort of a lack of knowledge about history. That's where I think the real issue lies in the public discussion. I think, as Lanhee said, yes, history, it's important to remember Robert E. Lee's role, but let's not suggest he was in any way on equal footing with the fathers of our country.
Well, and he lost, which surprises me that President Trump would want to celebrate someone who lost.
Yeah. And amid all this, some Republicans have spoken out. Very few have mentioned President Trump by name. Some have stayed silent completely. Has this caused irreparable damage to the Republican Party this week?
I think that it has created some divisions that are not going to heal anytime soon. I will never say it's irreparable, because in politics, you know, people have multiple lives, right? But there clearly is damage to the relationship between the governing majority in Congress and the White House. There are divisions between individual members that, frankly, the president needs for his agenda. You take a guy like Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona, who has actually voted for the president's agenda. He voted for Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court. He voted with the president on the repeal and replacement of Obamacare. And he's somebody who the president, it's not like he can waste his vote. The president needs his vote. But then the president's out there tweeting all of these crazed things about Jeff Flake. So there is damage, and I think in some cases it will be very difficult to repair going forward.
I think we had a moment here, line in the sand, when you had senators like Bob Corker this week raising questions about President Trump's stability, his competence in office. I think,
and this is someone who's had a collegial relationship with the president.
That's what's so shocking, and I think more and more you've seen Republicans now speaking up and naming him by name. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz. A lot of Republicans didn't want to mention the T word this week, Trump. They talked about nationalism, white nationalism, so forth. But you're now starting to see them come forward and starting to question the president's judgment. And that is a big division. You've also seen some Republicans, Mitt Romney included, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, who this week just delivered a real jab at Trump in a video that got something like 8 million views within a couple of hours. So Republicans are starting to speak up. The question, as Lanhee says, is it's all about the poll numbers. It's all about where they think what they think this is going to cost them.
And the poll numbers show that his base is sticking with him.
Yeah. I mean, you know, there's some polls that have showed a slight dip in his base, but it's nothing that is really significant enough for people to say that the base for Donald Trump has left Donald Trump. And until there is more of that departure politically, I think it's going to be difficult for members of Congress to separate themselves. By the way, the Bob Corker thing is really interesting because Senator from Tennessee, chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was one of the first supporters of Donald Trump's foreign policy pronouncements on the campaign trail, was a candidate for Secretary of State.
Yes.
For him to come out and say competence and judgment and really go to those questions was really significant, I thought.
I want to ask you about the white supremacy groups, too. I mean, there's a lot of coverage, obviously. We're sitting here talking about it. But at what point is all this coverage actually helping white supremacy groups because it is amplifying their message?
I mean, I think they have learned to use social media, cable television coverage to great effect, and that has helped grow their audience in a disturbing way. And the fact is we are seeing things that we have never seen before in American politics. When you had Dana Rohrabacher this week, Daily Caller, reporting that a white supremacist Holocaust denier helped arrange his meeting with Julian Assange. That never would have happened in the past. That would have been poison politically.
Is it an ethical dilemma, though, for reporters like yourself, for example?
You know,
how much coverage to give?
I think this is an issue we really have to grapple with. You had Vice News this week, you know, embedded with the white supremacists. I think it showed a lot of people this horrifying image of who they really are. At some point, though, you're right. How much do we give them coverage when it comes to some of these rallies and protests? And how much are we just amplifying what they're saying?
I have to wrap up. We have about a minute remaining, but I have to ask you this. It seems like, Lanhee, this week Trump and corporate America broke up. Yeah. He disbanded the two advisory councils.
I don't know who broke up with who, but it was a breakup.
The breakup was started with 8 people resigning, and then it kind of snowballed from there. But was this a tipping point? Is it a permanent breakup?
Well, look, I think that there is an interesting thing that's happening, which is that you have a constituency that traditionally has been very supportive of Republicans. I mean, you think about the CEOs of these major companies, you think about these business groups. These are people that are very much aligned with Paul Ryan, for example, in thinking about tax reform, and they have sort of publicly said, look, we cannot associate ourselves with the president. That is a remarkable thing to see these constituencies moving away from a Republican president. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime, but we're at a dangerous point for the conservative movement more generally, and I'll just conclude briefly by saying the challenge for the conservative movement is that there are legitimate conservative views now that are getting commingled with these ridiculous views, reprehensible views from white nationalists and others. For the conservative movement, it's also a time of choosing to separate themselves and present a legitimate point of view.
A lot of conflation going on. Yeah. Lanhee Chen, Hoover Institution Research Fellow, and Carla Marinucci with Politico. Thank you both.
Thank you.
As we've just discussed, the events in Charlottesville have ignited debate about race, free speech, and our nation's history. And joining me now for a congressional perspective on the week's events is Congressman Adam Schiff, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
What is your reaction to the events following Charlottesville?
I think, like most people, I was appalled. I was, at the time, in Normandy with my son, who was a teenager, and we were looking at the bitter cost that was paid to defeat these ideas of racial supremacy and to turn on the TV and see back home these ugly actions by these neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and the violence and the attack on that woman who came to protest that pernicious ideology was just horrible. And then,
what are your thoughts on the way President Trump responded? Congresswoman Jackie Speer this week came out and said he should be removed under the 25th Amendment. Do you think he should be removed from office?
Well, I think his reaction was just appalling to suggest that those that gathered to protest these Nazis and white supremacists were somehow equally to blame. Was just awful and reflected, I think, a complete lack of judgment by the president and some flaw of character that I have a hard time defining.
Do you think the president should be removed from office, though? Do you agree with Congresswoman Speer on that?
You know, I don't know whether, those comments rise to the level of incapacity in office. Certainly this is not a president who I supported or believe in. I think a lot of his actions are inimical to the national interest, but whether it rises to the level of Article 25 incapacitation, I don't know that we're there yet. But I do think you have a lot of people now on both sides of the aisle raising serious questions about his fitness for office. You saw Senator Corker with some very strong words about the president's capacity that we haven't heard from Republicans until very recently, and I think that's significant.
We've seen a number of Confederate monuments and symbols come down across the country. There are still Confederate statues inside the U.S. Capitol representing 9 southern states. House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi has called for their removal. What is your position on that?
Well, I agree with Leader Pelosi. I think that those statues belong in museums in the proper context so that people can understand when they were erected, what those figures' role was in history. But in the Capitol, that's a place usually where we have statues that bring the country together, that are a source of pride for the country. These statues don't fall in that category, and I think they should be in a museum.
Do you think Congress should at this point convene a special commission to look into the rise of white supremacy groups, see what the dangers are, see what can be done about it? The Southern Poverty Law Center says there are nearly 80 hate groups in just California alone.
I think that's a worthwhile idea. What we're seeing in the United States right now, frankly, we're seeing in other parts of the world as well. We've seen a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, and in particular in places like Hungary. We're seeing, strong anti-immigrant sentiments that were in part responsible for Brexit. And I think this is also not unrelated to the rise we're seeing in authoritarianism around the world. And this is a real global challenge. So understanding why this is coming out now, why it is rising to the fore, I think is very worthy of our study and every effort to resist it.
Is it something you might call for yourself, convene a special commission on this?
Well, I would certainly support that idea. And I have to say, though, one of the things that is most concerning about all this is that rather than have a president who unequivocally rejects this and tries to bring the country together, we have a president who's making the problem worse. And I think just fanning the flames. And more than that, doesn't seem to recognize that's what he's doing. No commission can solve that problem, I'm afraid.
I'd like to ask you about the international issue of North Korea as well. This week, South Korean President Moon Jae-in said President Trump has agreed to seek his consent before launching any military action against North Korea. How would you characterize the current state of relations between North Korea and the United States?
Well, they've always been, extraordinarily poor, given that North Korea has been run by mercurial dictators since its founding. I do think they've reached a new and dangerous stage where you have belligerent statements from Pyongyang matched by often belligerent, bombastic statements from our own president. That's not helpful. I think what is helpful are the sanctions that we obtained at the United Nations, putting additional pressure on China to clamp down on the trade of North Korea. We have to hope that we can impress upon China the importance of really cutting off North Korea's financial and export lifeline until it comes to the table to bring about a cessation of its nuclear and missile programs and ultimately a rollback of those programs. But the belligerent statements, the suggestion that comments out of Pyongyang are going to result in fire and destruction, none of that advances the objective of halting North Korea's programs. In some ways, it's in fact deeply counterproductive. So it's a dangerous situation. I read with interest those comments coming from South Korea. I don't know that, frankly, you would have a commander-in-chief say something quite that broadly. If the United States needed to protect itself, we're not going to seek the permission of other countries to do that.
Are you casting doubt on whether Mr. Trump said it at all, or are you?
Who knows with this president? It's certainly, I would hope, the case that if we were going to embark on any military action that was not an emergent response to a direct attack or impending attack by North Korea, that we would consult with all of our allies in the region. But I would never, as Commander-in-Chief, give any country a veto over what was necessary to protect our country.
And we only have about 30 seconds remaining here, but if I could just ask you for a quick update on the Russia investigation. I know that your panel's investigation is continuing, but have you had any contact with Special Counsel Bob Mueller on his investigation? We
have, and we're doing our best to coordinate with him, with his office. We obviously don't want to take any step that might interfere in his ability to prosecute someone if he finds the evidence to support that. Are you privy to any of that information along the way? Well, you know, we're certainly developing our own information. We have some insights into what the special counsel is doing. But again, it's a relationship of coordination. It's not working hand in hand. All right. Congressman Adam Schiff, so nice to have you in our studio today. Thank you for coming by. This is orientation week for thousands of freshmen at UC Berkeley. It's also the start of the academic year for Cal's first woman chancellor, Carol Christ. In the wake of the deadly incidents in Virginia, Christ must tackle how her campus will handle future events at Cal involving white supremacists and nationalists. There have been clashes over the past year over having right-wing speakers on campus. At a press conference this week, Christ said she's determined to protect both free speech and student safety.
We now know that we have to have a far higher number of police officers ready in order to assure both the safety of our community and to assure that the events that in which legitimate student groups have invited can take place.
I sat down earlier with Chancellor Christ at UC Berkeley to talk about her goals for the university. Chancellor Carol Christ, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Well, you first joined UC Berkeley in 1970 as an assistant English professor, and at the time, only about 3% of the faculty were women. Right. You are now the first woman to lead Cal in its nearly 150-year history. What is this moment like for you?
Well, nobody asked Clark Kerr what it was like to be the first male chancellor, and yet people constantly ask me, what is it like to be the first woman chancellor? Of course it's exciting. Of course it marks a kind of change in women's opportunities and situations since I joined the faculty in 1970. But I think that if you think of yourself in just a gendered way in a leadership role, that diminishes your sense of that, of all the ways in which you lead.
As chancellor, what are your biggest goals for UC Berkeley?
First, I want to rebuild community. The last few years have been hard years for Berkeley, and the morale is flagging, and so I'm really focused on rebuilding a sense of community. Secondly, I want to enhance the undergraduate experience. A big piece of enhancing the undergraduate experience is developing more housing. In addition, our students, faculty, and staff can and should be more diverse than they are. And we are no longer as generously funded by the state as we once were. And so we need to develop a new model that's more dependent on diverse revenue sources.
Part of the student experience is, of course, tuition for many students. And UC is set to increase its tuition for the first time in 6 years. What impact will that have at Cal?
Half of our students will not pay that tuition increase because they receive financial aid. I believe that we need a steady policy for very low tuition increases so we don't have the kind of situation that's unfortunately characterized the University of California for a number of years of no tuition increases for a number of years and then a spike in tuition. I myself believe it's appropriate for students whose families can afford to pay tuition to pay modest tuition.
There has been much talk about free speech here at UC Berkeley. And given what happened with the Milo Yiannopoulos appearance, the Ann Coulter appearance, and how much controversy and how much bitterness there was, how would you handle similar situations in the future?
So first, what I'm going to do is have many conversations as a campus about free speech and about community. Then I hope we can model a kind of robust debate between people of sharply divergent views that we've unfortunately lost in our democracy, so that people can understand what civil discourse is like between people who disagree. I believe that Berkeley should be able to host people of very conservative views. Indeed, Berkeley does host many of those people, though perhaps not of the controversial profile of either Milo Yiannopoulos or Ann Coulter.
Do you think the university mishandled those earlier situations with Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter?
No, I do not. I think there was no way we could anticipate the almost an invasion of the campus by a paramilitary group that was outnumbered the police and was committed to use violence to stop the Milo Yiannopoulos event.
These paramilitary groups, though, show no sign of letting up if this situation were to happen again in the future. So how would you address that?
I hope that we will be able to create such a strong consensus in the Berkeley community that this is our campus and we do not want violence on our campus, that will be a countervailing force. We've also learned a lot about how to use the police in relationship to such an event.
You succeeded former Chancellor Nicholas Dirks, and his tenure was marked by widespread criticism of his handling of sexual misconduct scandals here at UC Berkeley. Many faculty members and students also complained Dirks was distant and disengaged. How would you describe your style of leadership?
I'm very much a shoe leather kind of person. I intend to be really present on the campus, to be very much engaged with people in all of their various communities. I think that the campus community needs a lot of healing, and in part the Chancellor does that by her presence.
Well, Chancellor Carol Christ, we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
And that will do it for us. You can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.